What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the 3D Muscle Journey podcast. This is your Chief Science Officer, Eric Helms, and I'm joined by Coach Alberto Nunez, as well as our mental health specialist, Amanda Rizzo, to talk about a topic we have not covered, and I feel bad even just saying this. We haven't been doing our due diligence in over 3 years. How much over 3 years? I don't want to say, but long enough that we need to do an update on this. And we're going to specifically talk about disordered eating, eating disorders, body image concerns, and how they relate to not only competitive physique sport and weight class restricted sport, but also all the non-competitors out there, like many of you who follow our podcast. And this is something that it seems like it's on the rise to some degree. I wonder if this is kind of like ADHD, is that once people became aware of its prevalence and it started getting accurately diagnosed at the more appropriate rates, and we're just seeing that now. There is data to indicate that this is on the rise, not only in the traditional population who gets to benefit from this wonderful thing of women, but also in men these days, perhaps exacerbated by social media and changes in what is seen as normative body types, especially if you're out there following fitness content. And we've talked about this before, even if it's not body image stuff, like powerlifting these days. If you follow powerlifting, you're probably going to follow the best powerlifters, and it's very easy that just being a big fan of like the Sheffield and IPF worlds with the explosion of talent in the last 10 years, you might think it's pretty damn normal for, someone who's, a 150-pound woman to be totaling 400 to 500 kilos. Like that should be easy, right? Or if you're a dude and you weigh, 180 pounds, you think, oh, I should probably be totaling 1,600 pounds. I'll throw one out there for the American. That's totally normal. 600-pound squats is something that means you're strong, when previously, not too long ago, anyone squatting 405 would get some credibility. And it's this kind of echo chamber where we're amplifying some of the most outlier performances. Fun fact, if you're a male and you bench 2 plates, that's 102 kilos or 225, based upon normative population data, you're stronger than 75% of men who work out. 2 plates. So, yeah, I think we sometimes we just forget what it is to develop this stuff. So we start seeing these fitness models, or we start seeing these incredible athletes, and that can create these internal dialogues that aren't necessarily true. So anyway, what are we talking about? I think first, before I even jump into that, it's important to discuss the concept of scope of practice, because this is a sticky, challenging thing if we look at it from the practitioner side. I've had the pleasure and privilege of writing the scope of practice chapter for the National Academy of Sports Medicine's Physique and Bodybuilding Coach Manual. I'm also on the advisory board for the Sports Nutrition Association. So this is something we talk about a lot. And I've seen this operate in different countries with different regulatory bodies, from the US, which differs by state, to Australia, which is different from New Zealand, and New Zealand, which is kind of some weird combination of the two when you look at how things are or are not regulated. And more importantly, having been a full-time and then a part-time coach, and then being intimately involved with our specialists here at 3DMJ, and figuring out what do we do when we screen or have intake forms, or when do we decide to go hit the panic button and go, hey, Riz, I don't know if I'm stepping outside of my scope of practice. How do I help this client? What do I do? And I don't want to harm them. It's a tough tightrope to walk, and we've definitely done it wrong at times. I've seen a response from a client or a potential client who applied and mentioned that they had a previous history of eating disorders. And we go, hey, we would like to get clearance from your doctor, and would you be interested in also consulting our, mental health consultant? And the coach maybe didn't handle that delicately enough, or maybe this is the way the person would have responded no matter what. They were very offended, and they felt like they're being pathologized and disempowered because they'd gotten over that eating disorder and they wanted to work with us. So it's not easy to know how to respond as a practitioner. It's not easy to know when to respond. And the scope of practice guidelines are relatively clear on paper, but that's not how they operate in the real world. We know that we're not supposed to be providing actual clinical diagnosis or treatment of any mental health issue that would fall under the scope of an allied health professional. So that sounds clear enough. But when you actually dig into something like the DSM and you try to go, okay, what's the definition of an eating disorder or disordered eating or orthorexia or muscle dysmorphia, and what's a pathological level of body checking, and then, okay, the behavior is only one component of it, but how is it impacting their lives, understanding the actual subjective experience of it. It's enough to make many practitioners just basically take one of two stances. Either say whatever, and I'll just deal with it as it happens, and not have any kind of things in place. For the record, I don't recommend that. Or taking the ultra-conservative stance of, if anything seems to even like creep into the realm of psychology, not my scope, I'm out, refer out, peace. And I think you really need to operate somewhere in the middle. The latter is probably safer from a cover your ass perspective, but I think the reality is, and I learned this as a personal trainer, you're going to be the first point of contact for your clients when they get an ouchie, when they are struggling with something, when they are thinking about divorcing their partner, when they're not enjoying their job. You become their friend, their confidant, and you're asked to dip your toe into many different scopes of practice. So I think probably one of the most important things is knowing the importance of screening and having people to refer to, because you also have to think about what's the potential harm of being overly conservative and just saying nope, and the person maybe does not have a support system, or they feel pathologized, or they are now going to go to a coach who will actually work outside of their scope and give them even a worse treatment than you would have given. So not necessarily a clear environment and not necessarily a risk-free environment. So we're going to talk through all that today. And first, I want to kick it over to you, Alberto Nunez. You've seen a lot. You haven't seen it all because we never have, and we're always surprised, but you've seen many of the things that go on out there. In both your competitive and non-competitive clients, what are some of the most common issues you see that you feel fall within your scope? And then how do you deal with them? And then how often and what do you do when you feel something does truly fall outside of your scope?
Probably the most common thing I see involves body fat loss and people trying to skip too many steps in that department, or they have already, where, maybe they grew up overweight and they want these abs like this summer. And I know what's going to happen if we get abs this summer. And I have to propose these timelines where it's like, okay, I think we might need more spread out exposure time with like breaks in between to get to your body fat goals. So every once in a while, either I miscalculate and I don't see it, and like we cross that line. I'm getting better at it, but it still happens where it's like, oh, okay, I think we went too far. We need to turn back. And I know it's waiting for us if like we keep going. Then, it becomes one of those situations where, depending on the person, like it might be like, okay, like it just took you kind of regaining your weight in 3 months and we're okay. But for some people, it might be something that leaves them limping for years even. So that's probably the most common thing I see is like just trauma via fat loss. And it isn't always just like the contest preppers. Like I think people underestimate your body's natural response to just underfeeding for prolonged periods of time. Because, with the contest preppers, usually there's like these steps that took place. It's like, okay, they've seen abs before, they've seen vascularity in all their limbs before, and now we decided to make that next leap. So I think a lot of folks, because that's not what they're going for right now, they just want their abs, they just want to look good on vacation. They don't realize that, like you only know what you know. There was a conversation on Facebook, actually. It was pretty refreshing. Someone was posting about how people just complain way too much right now. And some guy snuck in there who had cancer as a child. And he was like, no, I don't think so. He's like, you might see me as tough, but it's because of what I've been exposed to. It's like people know what they know, really. So the same thing with like fat loss. When people aren't going for these, like, as Mike likes to say, these exotic levels of body fat, they underestimate just how much that can mess you up. So as you said, because you go through your feed, just looks like, yo, everyone's doing it, I'm gonna give me some of that. I think, yeah, just all sorts of fat loss, not just contest prep, but all sorts of fat loss interventions end up leaving people limping because it's like loading a bar with too much weight for right now. Like, we can see that's very clear. But when it comes to the fat loss side of things, it's sneaky, it's slow. It catches a lot of people off guard, and it messes them up.
So I'd like to jump in here. Oh, sorry.
Absolutely.
Just noting on the clinical side, something that I've seen is almost the taking away of the fat loss phase or the competitive side of bodybuilding. I've seen a lot of people kind of just like crumble because that has given them something to focus on other than other deeper issues that they're trying to maybe avoid or just cope with better, numb from. So I agree as well that, yes, fat loss phases or just competing that season alone can be extremely detrimental, or it's a sign of something deeper. And then when that is removed, it's as though they are naked and more vulnerable. So that's when I see a lot of issues arise, at least with my clients.
Oh, that's really interesting.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I was curious to know, what are the signposts for Berto and Eric, you as well, to know whether or not to push the gas and say, like, okay, we can go into this fat loss phase, or you're okay to compete for another show or whatnot, versus we need to take a step back.
That's interesting because on my end, that is kind of like what I see. I'm like, well, why does this matter so much? Like we're going to get there at some point. And if you follow this path that I think would be more appropriate for you, like, you're like pretty close to 100% likely to get there. Like, but you're so like so it's like a distraction, so they don't have to deal with all the things that maybe they should be like investigating further.
It sounds like a sense of urgency.
Yeah, but it makes no sense sometimes, because it's like I will explain to them like what can happen on the other side. Like if things go not just like terrible, but like, you know, what is likely to happen most of the time. But in regards to symptoms, I think first thing is adherence. Like, they just have a hard time being consistent, and you can tell it's wearing them out when, okay, it's like you give them X amount of retries, and then of course you kind of, you should adjust the plan to like, okay, what can this person tolerate? And as you're adjusting the plan and making it more digestible, but we're still not really getting anywhere, like, to me, that is a sign that, okay, you're already like within this fat loss phase, you're worse than than where you started. We need some extra time to regroup. We need to get away from this goal and work on something else. So that's probably the biggest red flag, when things that, and especially based off their history, like if at some point you were able to do something that was more demanding than what I'm asking from you right now, but you can't currently, and it's not for other reasons, like just the environment isn't right. Yeah, that to me is a huge red flag that, okay, like we should probably rest this task for a little bit.
Yeah. To echo Berto, I've, you were saying it doesn't make sense. And I think framing it in the way you were describing it, Riz, helps us understand why it does make sense internally. So we're essentially looking at a coping behavior. It's not a facilitative coping behavior. It's arguably it has costs, right? But most things we do as humans in response to things that are problems is we find a way to cope. whether that's substance abuse, whether that is passive aggressiveness, whether that is any type of interpersonal odd behavior, becoming far more introverted around your family than you would in other places because you know what happens when you speak up and that ain't worth it, or being the negotiator or the peacemaker. Anytime you get a family and you look at like there's more than 3 or 4 kids, there's some pretty predictable roles that people are going to fall into based upon their personality disposition and the type of dysfunction in the family. There's like the rebel, there's the good kid, there's the peacemaker, and then there's the invisible fly on the wall. Because each one of those, children at different times and different personality traits and genetics and interactions with the evolving social dynamic finds a way to feel safe and survive, right? And then we carry those things out into the world, and they're a mixture of nature and nurture. So if someone down the track is going, okay, well, now I have a substance abuse problem and it's gotten to the point where I can't manage it and I can't hold down a job. Taking away the substance abuse is very challenging. Dealing with addiction, there's a whole related thing with that. And most of the time when it is successful, the person also finds new coping strategies. Being so introverted to the point where you have social anxiety, and let's use the same example. You can't hold down a job because you can't interact with people. You can't just go, well, why don't you just talk to people more? How about you just try doing something different? Is not ever a solution. They have to find some way to cope with the social anxiety. So when I have a client who is unwilling to do what is optimal on paper and what they can rationally agree is the best thing for the goal that they have stated, I want to be the best physique athlete I could be. I want to be in the best position to succeed. Okay, cool. We'll build some muscle. We'll set you up. We'll get body fat to this level. We'll establish these behaviors. We're going to diet in a year and a half. And they go, no, I want to start next week and I want to be 16 weeks out. And they can't really well articulate, but they have frustration, angst, and a drive to do it right now. Only some of that can be explainable like by passion and interest. I think another part is that, this is they're coping with something. What they think this is, and maybe whether they're aware of it or not, is not what it actually is or not what it only is. And it's not an uncommon thing that once people realize that the reason they're participating in physique sport or not participating and just pursuing recurring fat loss diets has more to do with some other issue, and they find another way to deal with that is perhaps more healthy or in line with their goals or their happiness, then all of a sudden they can make more rational decisions about it. So I think that was a really good piece of insight, Riz, because I think that is something that we need to acknowledge, even if we're not the ones as the coach who is, has the scope of practice to provide an alternative coping strategy. Just acknowledging that we can't just take away someone's method of coping, even when it's a negative. Like self-harm doesn't just go away. People don't just decide. To get really dark for a second, and trigger warning. People who have suicidal ideation or are considering ending their lives, that is consideration of a coping strategy in their minds many times because they cannot deal with the current suffering. And just locking them in a room and having them on suicide watch is a temporary fix. Like once they feel they have access. Traumatic. Exactly, right? You're causing other issues. And you have to address what is it that I'm suffering from that I'm trying to get away from. And that's why I have a coping strategy. So ultimately, that's what we're getting at. And Berto, I want to come back to you because you talked about it in relatively ambiguous terms because I know there's a lot that it can look like in terms of it or trauma. And you mentioned adherence, one of being those early warning signs. But what I think you did a really good job. You talked about there's biology to this, right? The process of getting to exotic levels of leanness, the process of restricting energy intake, there are biological roots that will result in predictable behavior. And, to some degree, it is just as simple as, all right, we need to not go to that well too frequently, or you kind of get stuck in these little traumatic loops and you never physiologically recover. And you kind of find yourself in this, I will say, biologically mediated neurotic behavior that causes a lot of stress. And if the person is willing to be rational with you, they can go, okay, I just need to actually recover, take some time off and not do this for a while. or, set up some skills and modify my environment so that when I do this, it's not as traumatic and I can get further or to my goal or have more likelihood of it being sustainable. But talk to me about when and what other types of things you see, and when does it exceed you going, you know what, this is not just the trauma of dieting?
Yeah, I think it's one thing when you're just not able to, and I'll move the goalpost, like if okay, an average of 1,550 calories was just like too intense for you. It's like, okay, well, we'll plop it up a little bit. We'll play with training volume. We'll weigh only when I ask, things like that. So I'll do that. And there's with fat loss, it's like there's a broad spectrum of, I guess, intensities that will work. It would just take a little bit longer, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if all that is not working, it's kind of like, okay, maybe we need a reset. But I think when it's like, all right, this is something I can't do on my end, is when it's just starting to get in the way of other things in life. Like it's creating tension, like with their relationships. They're just not keeping up with their other responsibilities, or it's causing more anxiety than I feel this goal should cause. Should take up in your mind, where it's like, this is it's important to you, but it shouldn't be that high up on your list, right? Like we know this with preppers, right? Where it's like, bro, like this is like the third warning you got at work about this. Like maybe that last show we should get rid of. But it happens with all sorts of like fat loss phases, because again, it's like, what you know. For some people, like getting to 12% body fat is like what 6% is to others. So yeah, once it starts impacting those around them, perhaps creating problems that are going to be around longer than, like they're going to matter more, like in the future, like kids flunking out of college. At that point, it's like, okay, this is bigger than this. Is that I can't just fix some things on a spreadsheet and like we're going to be good. At that point, you have to, seek the help of someone like Amanda.
Mm. So it's not just adherence. It's also that whether there is adherence or not, it comes at a cost to things that are outside of the typical, like what we think of as the impact of dieting. Like I'm a little more lethargic. I'm a little more irritable. I can't do as much volume. It's starting to really leak out into their lives.
They're harming themselves and others, basically.
Yes. And an important thing to realize is that as online coaches who are getting check-ins and playing a little more of a reactive role, for us to know that means that the person is disclosing that too, which I think is an important piece of context for everyone to understand. It's not like we're living in their living room and we're like, yeah, there they are being weird again. So
that is the threshold, though, Berto, that you just explained. That's when it turns into more of a clinical problem, and they should be seeking clinical support or help. Although, Eric, you did point out that on paper they can actually look stellar, and that's where perfectionism is a character trait that we often see in this community, where they can be an A+ student and internally they are imploding, or they are self-isolating, or they're having a lot of issues within the relationships. And on the other extreme, they could have a lot of just psychological distress, and that is one of the clinical factors when it comes to diagnosing, where they have to have clinical distress, and or others have to be severely impacted from their behaviors. So like you said, they are not attending to other responsibilities. They are not supporting their loved ones or just creating more connection. And that is oftentimes something that's reported by them when someone comes to me with these sorts of issues, whether or not they meet criteria for a full diagnosis. It's more so they feel a lack of connectedness from others and from themselves. That is something that is probably at the heart of most issues here, when you just disconnect from yourself. And then they cope. They develop some sort of coping mechanism, which at the time, I want to kind of clarify, at the time, it was functional for them.
Mm-hmm.
It might have just been, although we can list it as, oh, this is dysfunctional, but at that time it was functional for them and it was helping them survive, essentially. Mm-hmm. And then oftentimes once they're out of those situations, they haven't learned better coping mechanisms or better, more adaptive behaviors. And that's when we start seeing things that are more alarming.
Yeah.
So, that's why I also brought up when we take out contest prep from a lot of competitors, and they're more so in the quote unquote off season, sometimes they struggle there too.
Mm-hmm.
That's why some people are addicted to the stage, because it's like you're competing. It's like you kind of know you're getting worse like every year. Like, this makes no sense. And you learn a little bit more, and it's like, oh, I see what you were maybe an addict before, and
yes.
You just don't want to have temptation over the summer. So it's like, I'm just going to shred down and be a hermit. So
it's still an addiction.
You it's exactly. Yeah. One replaces the other in that situation. But yeah, I mean, this is, I've always I feel like because I've made wrong calls where like I have used bodybuilding to like cope with things, but like it's I feel proficient in this world. If anything, it makes it like more tempting sometimes. Like right now, newborn, I'm like, I might prep this year, and I've thought about that. I'm like, no, bro, it's like your world feels so out of control right now. Is this something you're gonna do just to like let me have this one corner like of my life that like I know I can like have full command over? And it goes back to like, well, is this going to be fair to them? Am I going to be as available? So yeah, even when you know better, like it's tempting. And I think as you become more proficient at this, it becomes more of like your safe haven for like when life goes wrong or just stressful.
Yeah. And so much of this comes down to framing. And honestly, so much of mental health is about how you frame things, because that leads you towards the cognitions you have about it, which leads you to the emotions, leads to the behaviors, which either do or don't work for you. And I think a really useful way of thinking about it is not, is this pathologized or a disorder or good or bad, but is it facilitative? Does it facilitate what you're trying to achieve, or does it create dissonance? Does it create problems in your life and you don't know another way out, so you feel this push and pull in both directions? Like, oh, I want to be lean and competitive, and this is the one pretty much everyone can relate to, but I'm also really hungry and I just want to eat and I don't want to feel restricted. And bouncing back between those two extremes is something that a lot of people feel during, say, the recovery phase. And to some degree, that's normal. And if it's manageable and you can get through the recovery process, then that just is part of it. I mean, we feel dissonance around when we were in high school. Like, I want to go out with my friends, but I also need to do homework. I want to have a social life, but I also don't want to not get into a good school, and I'm worried about my future. And you feel this push-pull. Not too dissimilar. And so anyway, coming back to the idea of framing, I think the idea, like you talked about, Amanda, instead of framing something as a disorder, reminding them, which can be quite empowering. You're not trying to like cut off or amputate this part of you that you found this coping strategy, maybe acknowledging, hey, you as an adaptive, resilient child, as a 4-year-old, how brilliant were you to figure out how to deal with this really unhealthy, family life? And guess what? That person's still in you. You are still someone who can figure out a new coping strategy. We just got to figure out a new one, because the one you've been using for the last 15 years, it ain't working for this. So thank you, 4-year-old me. But let's bring now my in this example, my 19-year-old, more experienced person to the table, and we can figure out what do we do in this situation. And by the way, as your clinician, I'll help you. So that's one aspect of, I think that's really important to acknowledge, is framing. We understand we can't just take away a coping strategy and expect things to go well. It's not how that works. And Berto, to your point, is it facilitative or debilitative? Like, okay, I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with using physique sport to cope with something, right, so long as it's facilitative. So let's say your life is chaotic. It's tough right now, financially, relationally, all that stuff, and you're trying to deal with it. And part of your ability to deal with it is bolstered by that hour and a half you get 5 days a week where you go to the gym and you just focus on moving the weight. And when you sit down from your meals and you know that you're ticking your boxes, and then that gives you the comfort, the empowerment, the sense of control, so you can take that out into your life and deal with these relational or financial issues. That's quite different than running away from them and having 2-hour-long workouts and deciding, I need to jump in a contest prep, so that everything else gets pushed to the side and you have an excuse to focus only on that thing that you do feel a sense of control over. And that will give you these immediate sense of life being better, because now you have things you can manage and you have a sense of security and empowerment in your world. But if your job is crumbling around you, your relationships are crumbling around you, you're getting divorced and you're accepting a lower pay cut and you're downsizing your apartment, and you're like, I don't actually want those things in my life, but my behaviors are leading me to that because I'm not actually coping. I am, running away. I think that's going to look very similar. And that's the challenge here. And that's what I think kind of a theme that we're going to keep coming back to is the same behaviors can be facilitative or debilitative depending upon how they're framed and what they result in someone's life. And that's why it's not so clear cut. We can't just say, if you do this, if you track your food obsessively, you therefore have an eating disorder. It's not that simple. And it would be nice if it was, but it simply isn't, because humans are very complex.
I love that you said that, Eric, about discerning whether or not something that you're doing or engaging in is at the heart of it, like you're running away from something versus pursuing a goal. And that's more of I like to take my clients through this self-reflective exercise, whether it's in session or they do that outside. It's to recognize whether or not they are avoiding discomfort, which at times, we naturally do as humans. Although, are we doing that to a point where it's detrimental and we are actually avoiding something that is in accordance to our values, actually, versus avoidance of something that is actually hurtful to us. So someone that has historically had disordered eating behaviors, they can make the distinction that, if I track food, it's going to hurt me, versus someone that maybe has also had disordered eating, and that helps them stay on a healthy track of behavior. So that is just based on the individual themselves and being honest, and recognizing and being just raw and vulnerable, saying like, I might be avoiding something, but I'm willing to take a look at it because this other behavior that could potentially on the outside look like it's disordered, it's actually going to support other areas of my life versus take away or harm. So we kind of want to look at it more in a more global perspective.
Love it.
Hey 3DMJers, this is Andrea Valdez popping in with some really great news today. We just released Nutrition Fundamentals for Lifters, our latest course in the 3DMJ Vault by our Chief Science Officer, Eric Helms. This is the foundation of dietary understanding that every athlete needs before they start calculating their calories or their macros or any type of meal planning. All of those counting and tracking skills are great to learn, and of course, we already have Vault courses that cover them, but if you don't know their purposes and limitations, you'll likely shoot yourself in the foot by overestimating their importance and becoming overly reliant on them. There is so much wasted time trying to learn how to track food, how to lose fat, how to live life while hungry, and how to think about food all at the same time. And every experienced bodybuilder knows that the mental models are what should have come first. If you don't know how to holistically and productively think about your nutrition, it doesn't matter how much willpower or discipline you think you have. It'll all eventually snap. It always does, and you'll be forced to go back and learn these skills in the long run anyways. We've seen it time and time with our new athletes, and it's the first thing that we have to address before letting them enter another fat loss phase that will likely fail if we don't take a few steps back and get these things down. So since we've dealt with this problem so many times before firsthand, we knew it was something we had to add to the vault, and we can't wait for you guys to take the course. Nutrition Fundamentals for Lifters will go over energy balance, maintenance calories, behavior and habit tracking versus food tracking, how to find where you fall on the flexibility versus consistency scale, how to use body weight measurements, how to know when you're ready to cut or gain, 5 different ways to track your food, and a whole lot more. This is the 25th course in the 3DMJ Vault, which is our online learning platform of organized video-based education for serious lifters. And you can become a VIP member and get access to every single one of those courses by purchasing an annual or lifetime membership with a single one-time purchase. Head on over to 3dmjvault.com and sign yourself up today. That's 3dmjvault.com to get all access. Thanks so much for listening and enjoy the rest of the show.
You guys mind if I take a second and go, like, let's get some clinical definitions and talk through things so that people who maybe don't have as much experience in this realm kind of know what they might see and how it might be seen or described. So there's a wide world of things that can happen, and when we put things in boxes, we necessarily limit the constraints of what they could mean or could be or how they could be seen. And that's something we just have to accept whenever we're dealing with qualitative stuff, peoples. We're dealing with people rather than, numbers and just pure biology like we might like to do in exercise science. Like, oh, who ran faster? The timing gate measure you when you pass the laser. Yes, okay, you got faster. Not that simple. So there are some inherent loss of fidelity on the individual level, but the DSM, for example, which is the diagnostic manual for psychology, does say, hey, when we see these behaviors, they're typically occurring for these reasons or typical etiologies, and they can be useful for us to understand what's going on. We've got some umbrellas here. There are clinical eating disorders, and they have specific diagnostic criteria and specific behavior patterns like anorexia nervosa, bulimia, etc. And I think it's important to acknowledge that when you look at how these are actually diagnosed, a consistent component is not just the behavior, but also how the person feels about the behavior, which kind of shows that messiness. There's also body dysmorphic disorders. And one of the ones that we will sometimes see in physique sport is muscle dysmorphia, right? And this can also be challenging. Like every bodybuilder I know, at least in the bodybuilding division, wants to be bigger and feels they need to improve their physique. And they will feel that way regardless of any type of symptomology or underlying issue until they're actually the world champion who everyone unanimously says, yeah, you're untouchable. And even then they probably want to see if they can push it further, but it doesn't necessarily come from a inaccurate assessment of what their body looks like. It is rather striving for, to achieve something higher. It is akin to wanting to be able to shoot a higher percentage of 3-point shots, for their sport. And even if they're a non-competitor, it might be from an artistic perspective, I want to achieve some kind of some pinnacle or some ideal I have in my mind, rather than I think I look like shit, but I actually look amazing, to really kind of say it bluntly, right? So there's body dysmorphic disorders, there are eating disorders, and there's also things that are not yet classified, need more research, or fall into other realms. Like you might hear the term disordered eating. Now, one thing is when you do research in this area, you can't diagnose someone in the middle of the study, even if you could, because you're typically doing a survey. It's online. You don't have a clinician sitting there in front of them, especially if you're trying to get large N sample sizes of people and make inferences about them. So you can give them a similar questionnaire that might be used in clinical practice, but all you can say is they had higher scores for eating disorder-related symptomology, or they might use the term disordered eating. Or you might say, you didn't meet some of the criteria, and this might be in a clinical setting that Amanda would deal with, to get an eating disorder. but it's clear that this is causing you distress and you need assistance to deal with it. And therefore, I'm going to work with you in a similar capacity to I might with someone actually who has a full-blown eating disorder. So disordered eating typically falls into those two categories. In a research setting, it is more related to the symptoms of eating disorders. And then in a clinical setting, it might be, hey, you haven't hit that threshold, but you do need help based upon your experience. For example, binge eating disorder, there needs to be a certain number of occurrences of binges over a certain time period. But if you have them less frequently than that, but they're really a problem for you, it's not like, sorry, you're shit out of luck. Something should still be done about that, right? So something that I've written about both in peer-reviewed literature and I've talked about and wondered about, because I think it's very important, is how do we discern whether the things we need to do to reach your goals, if you have a healthy relationship with bodybuilding, how are they impacting the likelihood or the risk of, some of these problems occurring? And we've talked about a few of kind of the buckets that I have thought about them being in. We've talked about biology, which you brought up, Berto. Just the active dieting and being lean has an impact here. Rizzo, you specifically talked about predispositions. So what if someone has kind of underlying as part of their personality, perfectionism or neuroticism or obsessive tendencies, right? Mm-hmm. And some of that is, of course, modifiable, but a lot of it is, to some degree at least, baked in. And this can be in the form of I literally have been diagnosed with eating disorder in the past, or maybe I'm someone at a higher risk for it based upon my personality. The one we haven't specifically talked about, at least not directly, although you have talked about what can be changed, Berto, is the things we have to do to achieve our goals, to get to these biological states of being in a deficit or getting really lean. And that's where probably most of our focus is as a coach and in the evidence-based sector, is how do we make the active dieting more sustainable, easier, more evidence-based? Not always. Sometimes it's like, how do I just get shredded faster? Like, what's the rapid fat loss best way to do it? It's like, well, that might be the best way to lose fat and maintain muscle in the shortest, most effective time period, but it also might really mess you up. So anyway, I think some of the things that bodybuilders must do to some degree can potentially exacerbate some of these issues. And it's unclear, or at least it was unclear, I think we have more data now, which I'm going to talk about, as to whether they're moderators or actually causational. So what I'm talking about is, say, physique checking. This is very normal, and even your coach might even ask you to do it. Hey, every week, I would like you to send me your posing video, and I'll critique your physiques. I'll say, hey, we need to get leaner here, here, and here to modify your posing. You can imagine, and someone with a body image issue, muscle dysmorphia, concern about that, how sending naked check-ins to a coach who's going to tell you about your physique and judge it could be experienced, versus someone who has a relatively objective, judgmental view about their body, and they're trying to pursue something that's relatively disconnected to their self-worth or their sense of beauty. And it's just, hey, I want to try to, get better at this sport. Two very different views of the same thing. So can we look at body checking the same in clinical populations versus non-clinical populations, right? And interestingly enough, we do actually have some research on that. So there was a study published in 2021 on MyFitnessPal usage using a tracker. Another thing that you might be asked to do by your coach, not too unreasonable. And it was done in a couple hundred women in a college setting. And they just simply split them up into groups that tracked with MyFitnessPal and those that didn't. And they looked at whether or not they developed more symptoms of eating disorders, body image concerns, etc. And they did not find that those who were tracking had more symptoms. There was no significant difference between groups. And when you look at probably no meaningful differences. But a really important element of this was that they screened on the front end by giving similar questionnaire to what they used to actually look at the outcomes to say, okay, we're only going to let you participate in the study if you don't have a certain threshold for symptoms in the first place. And that's done for ethical reasons, because obviously they're doing this study because there's a potential they could find the other outcome, right? So an ethics board is not going to let you take people with eating disorders and be like, hey, let me see if I could poke that bear and really mess you up, right? But it also tells us a really important thing about the chicken or the egg. Because prior to this study and a few others, and this has been replicated, this isn't just the one oddball study that I'm preferentially telling you about. Multiple studies have found this now when you screen initially for people who don't have predisposition or existing eating disorder symptomology, that tracking in and of itself in a healthy population doesn't seem to lead to disordered eating or eating disorder symptoms. But other research. So, for example, a study in 2017 by Levinson found that 3/4 of people with eating disorders in this specific analysis did use MyFitnessPal or a food tracker, and 3/4 of those who did felt that it negatively contributed to their symptoms. So the experience of people who have eating disorders is such that, man, I'm doing this and I don't think it's helping me in most cases. And similar things have been seen for body checking. There was another study that was published, I think in 2017, if I recall correctly, and it was done by Bailey and Waller. And for the most part, they found that just like tracking your food and monitoring your food, monitoring your physique didn't seem to cause these issues, except specifically uncontrollable fear of weight gain after eating did seem to happen slightly more in those who were doing body checking more regularly, but it was moderated by, meaning it was statistically related to and more present in the people who experienced had higher baseline levels of negative eating pathology. So this shows the importance of screening and making sure that the people who come to you as a coach are in the best position to succeed. And that's something you've talked about a lot, Berto, is, making sure that when someone comes to me and they want to do this whole dieting thing, that I'm not setting them up for failure. So how many times have they been trying to diet on their own? How many coaches have they gone through? How much weight do they regain after dieting? How many times they tried to lose the same weight? And what is the cost of doing that? Because one of the biggest issues we see in the research on weight loss is that the more times you have these cyclical periods of weight regain, the more that degrades your self-efficacy and makes it more likely for you to stop trying or to get negative health consequences mental health concerns from repeated exposing yourself to these failed attempts at weight loss. So there is a potential cost here, but it's important to note that it is not the behaviors themselves that are causational, but rather they serve as moderators.
I'm curious to know what the screening was assessing, because just with my clinical judgment, I'm imagining that those behaviors, those body checking, tracking apps, just doing any sort of data collection, actually just reinforces one's own attitudes towards themselves, towards the world, towards food and exercise. So that could be something that can illuminate whether or not someone has a potential of developing an eating disorder or something that we can even do like preventative care.
Yeah. To answer your question, they specifically gave them the Eating Disorder Examination Questionnaire short form, or the EDEQS. And they had a cutoff EDEQS score of greater than or less than 2. So, so if they had a lower score than that, they could be included in the study.
Okay.
If they had a higher score than that, then they could not be. So, yeah, it's just a really important thing for people to understand. Sometimes there's a lot of research like this too. So, for example, the studies on visualization that show, oh my God, visualizing shooting free throws is nearly as good as actually shooting free throws. To be in that study, you have to show that you're actually really good at visualizing.
Right.
They screen you on the front end. They go like, all right, can you visualize well? There's a lot of people who, like, for example, I have a really tough time visualizing and remembering colors unless I've had something for a long time. Like, it's not like you'd be like, Eric, what color's your car? Like, I don't know. But if you were to be like, hey, you just saw me yesterday, what was I wearing? You're wearing a sweater. What color was it? I don't know. That's just me, I also can't do first-person visualization very well. I can only do third-person, like an observer, like imagining I'm on a camera. But some people, and the people who are best at visualizing and getting effect, and I will shut up about this tangent, they're really good at looking through their own eyes, seeing themselves go to the bar, feeling the bar on their back, and they can really replicate that experience. And there's data showing that first-person visualization is more likely to elicit some of these positive effects from visualization than third-person. But if you can't do it, so what?
What if you do all of them?
That's right.
That's fascinating. I'd actually like to look into that, but that's separate.
Yeah, it's a topic for another day. So that's kind of helping us understand the role of some of these behaviors. And obviously, some things can make this far worse than necessary. Let's talk a little more about biology for a second. Dieting on a lower calorie intake, getting way, way, way below your lower intervention point for body fat, losing a ton of weight. If we go all the way back to some of our first interesting research on this that actually looked at behavior, I would encourage everyone to look up the Wikipedia page on the Minnesota semi-starvation study, and then some retrospective analyses and assessments. There's actually like this book published in 1950. I think They Starved So We Could Live or something like that. There's a pretty good retrospective analysis of it where they discuss some of the behaviors. Simply dieting really, really hard and getting really, really lean will prompt many of the behaviors that we associate with some eating disorders. So, for example, the Minnesota semi-starvation study, for those who don't know, conscientious objectors during World War II, they enrolled in this study as part of what they had to do to not be drafted. These were men, and they were literally on a military base, and they had controlled. Once they gave their consent to participate, it's very different than research studies today. You don't get to drop out when you want. You have to basically be kicked out of the study. So would not pass ethics today, but it created this environment where they were basically forced to starve after they said, yeah, I'll try this out, and not knowing what they were getting into. Of course, no one knew what they were getting into. That's why we were researching it, because, oh my God, POWs, Holocaust victims, this is crazy. We're trying to refeed them, and there's some major issues, so we need to study this. So what they did 6 months, where they gave these people half what they needed to maintain their body weight in terms of calories, forced treadmill walking, because they started to get really lethargic and didn't want to move, an eventual buddy system so that they would actually adhere to the diet, and the behaviors were wild. So they started developing food rituals. These aren't people who are trying to get lean or valuing leanness or purposely engaging in a contest prep. They were going, yeah, we're studying semi-starvation. I have no desire to do this for my own personal goal, right? I'm not trying to see my abs. But they started adding water to their food to bulk it up. They started developing food rituals and eating things in very specific ways. There was a participant who afterwards changed their career and became a chef. There was a participant who cut off one of their fingers while prepping food on purpose to get disenrolled from the study. There was a group of buddies who were found in the commissary, which is the supermarket basically on base, just basically in the cereal aisle gorging themselves, and the MPs caught them, and they're like, what the hell? These guys got down to very, very, very low body fat levels. They experienced extreme metabolic adaptation, muscle loss, high levels of neuroticism, anxiety, mental fog, all the stuff that we associate with contest prep. And then they also tried different refeeding protocols. And this is where some of the first data indicating that reverse dieting is probably not a good idea is also there. And I won't get into that because this is not a reverse dieting podcast. But yeah, trying to refeed them in that whole process and watching them on the upswing. Pretty crazy stuff. And many of the symptoms of anorexia nervosa, at least at the time, which was many, many DSMs ago in the 1950s, they would have met the clinical thresholds at that time, which were back then far more based upon the biomedical model in allied health of not really considering how do these behaviors affect you, but are they weird? Are you not doing what you're supposed to be doing in the 1950s? Is your behavior aberrant, kind of deal? So if you're doing weird things with your food, regardless of what you think about it or how it's affecting you or your loved ones, that's, going to tick you up on the DSM criteria. To my best of my understanding, I do not have a copy of the 1950 DSM, but I just found it interesting that I don't think these people would have qualified for an eating disorder today. But biology has a huge impact on this. And I think it can't be discounted. And that's the one of completely unavoidable aspect of someone who wants to diet. If you want to get lean, you have to get lean. And if you want to get lean, you have to restrict calories or find some way to result in a negative energy balance. So doing everything you can to make that as minimally invasive as we like to call it as possible is one aspect of it. The other aspect is screening to make sure that you are in a position to do this and it's unlikely, or at least you're aware of the likelihood that it could bring up latent issues or prior issues. And then the final piece is, okay, I need to have someone in my network who I can refer to when it does start to become something that goes beyond my scope of practice. And then I think the confidence of just knowing that if you've done your job on the screening end to the best of your capability, if the person's well-informed, and if you're using the best evidence-based approaches, not just for maximizing fat loss, but also minimizing the potential harm that you're causing, and the biological invasiveness to only the degree that the person can take based upon their individual situation, environment, all that good stuff, you've done your due diligence, and you've controlled for everything basically except the biology, and they're at least aware of a potential predisposition. Then you've got someone who they can go to. And that's ultimately the best case scenario. And I feel pretty happy and comfortable now knowing that, okay, just asking someone to send me a physique check-in video or weigh themselves or to track their nutrition or track their food in some way. I don't need to maximize all of those things. I need to find basically the minimum threshold of doing those that gives me the information I need to be effective, because I can't know for sure that they don't have a predisposition towards an eating disorder. Or maybe they didn't disclose that they have a prior one. They didn't want to share that. It's up to them. So I'm not going to go hog wild on those, but I'll get the information I need, and I can have confidence, especially if we did the screening I was talking to them beforehand, that if something does come up, then I have pathways to say, hey, Riz, can you help out this client? Or probably first port of call, hey, what am I seeing this right? Is this an issue? What do you think?
Mm-hmm. I think something that probably the three of us face as far as a challenge and working with clients is the client's ability to be self-aware and to be vulnerable enough to say, I need help, or this is a problem, because societally, I think it's a lot of these things are normalized and if not glorified. So that can be just a barrier in terms of seeking help and getting out of this sort of loop. Because, I mean, there are also like financial ties as far as that, where people get sponsorships or they just get attention from social media. So it's kind of tricky in terms of our role and how we operate and how we approach clients when we start seeing red flags along the way.
Mm-hmm.
And whether or not it's our place.
Yeah, that's a really good point, is ultimately a lot of this, until it gets really extreme, it's patient-led, right? I think one of the reason why I say really extreme is, like, if you look at anorexia nervosa, it's an incredibly deadly disease. And sometimes the only intervention is needing to take the agency out of the person's hands, because they have so much control over their nutrition, they can literally starve themselves to death. So just removing that immediate likelihood of death and, getting them on feeding tubes or things like that, and then going, all right, now we need to start working on the underlying pathology and reasoning and cognitions that are leading to these behaviors that could kill you. But most of the time, when someone is going, I want to compete in a bodybuilding show, they're not at the point where they're needing to be admitted to a hospital for end-stage dangerous eating disorder pathology. It's more like this kind of edge case, unclear, maybe we can screen them, maybe not, and we aren't sure. And you're right, some of this stuff it's evolving in society and it's changing, it's unclear. So for example, you go back 20 years, I don't think the term orthorexia was even a term, but that is something now that is being debated and discussed in the literature and among clinicians as, is this a thing and how should we classify it? Is it consistent enough? So for example, I think it's worth talking about that you might not have heard of this, but things that don't fall under specific classifications of specific eating disorders are going to come up over time as society changes and as we get a better understanding of what's going on in our brains. So a pathological focus on healthy eating, which causes anxiety when dietary rules cannot be followed, which is all that experience thing, which negatively impacts psychosocial and physical health, is termed orthorexia nervosa. But despite there being like a clinical and scientific acknowledgement and interest in studying orthorexia, it's not fully understood or classified, and it's not in the DSM. And right now, as far as I'm aware of, there's this discussion of where it should fall under. Is this a body image concern? Is this an obsessive compulsive disorder? Or is this a unique eating disorder, which are not necessarily the same thing, even though they're linked? So, I mean, I think some clinicians believe that it should fall under avoidant restrictive food intake disorder, which is an eating disorder, but more of a catch-all. There's also, what is it, EDNOS? Is that correct?
EDNOS, yeah.
Eating disorder not otherwise
diagnosed or
stipulated or something, whatever the S stands for. Yeah. So there are tools clinicians have to say, hey, there's something going on here, but we don't fully understand its etiology. But there's a fair amount of discussion around maybe it is not actually an eating disorder, but it is a distinct issue altogether.
Subtype.
Yeah, exactly. And it somewhat doesn't matter, but I think it's just important to acknowledge that these things change, and as we understand them better, and they're going to be unique to the individual. And what we see a lot in the fitness industry is the moralization of food, right? The idea of good foods, bad foods, clean, unclean, which almost sounds like some type of very puritanical perspective on things. Makes me feel dirty when I eat a Snickers bar. Like that should make you cock your eyebrow, Or I've been with people who they see someone turn into a McDonald's and they're driving and they get mad. Like, how dare this person, do that? And they might be able to rationalize it as they're supporting whatever they see as this big, toxic, evil business. I think I've shared the story, and many people have seen it, where you go to like the CrossFit and they have like the Food Inc. like poster and talking about how basically you need to eat paleo because bad food comes from Food Inc. And it's literally it looks like it's like the silhouette of a nuclear processing plant, like the background in The Simpsons. And it's like just a black silhouette and it says Food Inc. And there's like this toxic fumes coming out. Like this is the most like not well thought through perspective of, the nuclear plants that make cheeseburgers. I'm like, that's not how any of this works.
There's virtue signaling, and then there's actual like cognitive dissonance operating in the background. Yeah, I mean that's the way we work as humans is we feel something, and then we try to figure out a rational explanation for it afterwards. Mm-hmm. Yeah,
not always. It's certainly true that sometimes we think about something and then we develop feelings about it based upon what is rational. But I think far more often than we'd like to admit, it is the other way around. So just because someone can justify like, oh well, trans fats and high sugar diets and the negative effect on appetite where you passively overconsume more, and also I don't want to support things that are negative for the environment. Like all that can be true, and that can lead to your decision about food, but you can also have these fears and this negative impact on your life and these behaviors that are not actually rational. Like I would rather eat nothing than eat this food that is only available to me here, even though I know like I'm not contributing to this in any kind of meaningful way. I'm not actually going against my values. This is really just me seeing this as a puritanical, unclean food that I don't want to sully my body with because out of fear or some type of strange belief. So how do you deal, Riz, I'm curious, with these relatively coloring within the lines, clear cut aspects that are not quite an eating disorder, not quite a body image concern. Maybe they're disordered eating, maybe they're orthorexia or nervosa, maybe there's something else. Does it bother you clinically or cause any consternation or slow you down if you can't put it into a specific classification, or do you not even think of that in terms of that?
Yeah.
That you just kind of deal with what's going on?
Yeah. To be honest, I don't focus so much, at least my approach in therapy, I don't focus so much on just reading through hard definitions of diagnoses, although yes, for ethical reasons and for documentation and working with insurance, I do have to do that. But when I'm working with clients, I don't refer to that. I don't go through line items or like check boxes or worksheets, and we're going to work this out through some sort of structure like that. My approach is far more flexible, if you will, and dynamic, because my perspective is that we're humans, and so we're going to fluctuate. We're going to react and respond to life and just what I deal with in session with them in a varied way. So yes, it is helpful to have these quote unquote diagnoses, or if we can get more studies around them, to be acknowledged through the scientific community, because we do get more just awareness around them, and people are able to seek help, or they feel less alone. They can find community through that and we also develop better treatments around those things. But I myself do not just focus on, okay, you have orthorexia, you have anorexia or muscle dysmorphia. So I need to approach it as such, because oftentimes that's basically a symptom of the larger issues at hand.
Right.
Like we talked about before, it's the coping mechanism of something that is greater, and it's usually something interpersonal, some trauma that happened in the past. And I'm not generalizing, or I am generalizing in this case, but oftentimes there's something deeper that is harboring within them, that is affecting them, and it's just manifesting in this way.
Yeah. It's not like having, let's say, an autoimmune disorder, and you're like, oh, that's why. Like, I think sometimes it can be quite empowering to be able to label something that you just don't know why it's affecting you this way, and you feel weird on the fringes. So for, I mentioned ADHD earlier. That's sometimes seen as like something that doesn't have as strong a biological roots as it does, but it does. It's very, very heritable. It's a very high probability that if you are diagnosed with ADHD, which is done quite reliably, believe it or not, that one of your parents does too. And it has one of the most effective treatments out there. Like Ritalin and Adderall have a number to treat that is bonkersly good. It's like 1.8, which means that for every 1.8 people treated with Ritalin and Adderall, they get an improvement in symptoms. If you compare that to like something for most diseases, they're double digits, and that's still considered decent or good. So when you tell like a doctor, like, oh yeah, the number to treat in this is 1.8, like, oh man, that's really effective, which indicates that this is a specific pathology, a specific cause with biological roots. If something like a specific stimulant that impacts the brain in a certain way seems to impact it. And you can see brain scans are different in people with ADHD versus those who are not. So if you're someone who is told your whole life you're just lazy, or you procrastinate, or you're just, you're a bad person who doesn't work hard, and you find out, oh shit, my attention related stuff is ADHD, that can be very empowering and life-changing. But I think the more we move away from things that have clear biological roots and can also be impacted by, like you said, traumatic events, a history of dieting, a family environment,
right,
et cetera. Not that they don't have biological roots, like anorexia is actually also highly heritable and genetically influenced. But when they're modified as well by the social environment you've been in and your life experiences, and they are more of manifestations of behaviors to deal with something, then yeah, I think being put in a box has the risk of being more limiting than it is empowering. So I think it makes sense that you're just basically chasing individual response, to put it in coaching terms. Like, all right, what's the problem? What are you dealing with? Where are you trying to get? How is it impacting you? And then how can I help you deal with that? Is that an accurate way of viewing it?
Yes. That last part that you described, it's more so like the client's definition or description of what they are experiencing, because that is very significant. Like we talked about, just your mentality around something, the way that you're thinking about yourself, what's going on with you. So that's a great information to pull from them, because then I have my clinical background and experience and using that within the session. But what I work with is that knowledge along with their story. And so we kind of want to just explore that and kind of delve into it, because there's threading back to whether or not that was a traumatic event that happened, or something that was biological and then reinforced in childhood because they saw their mother doing those behaviors, or classmates, whatever it is. And we kind of just want to dissect that and kind of lay it out. And that's where more of the rationalization comes up. And then that's when we see like the dissonance arise, and I'm just like reflecting a lot back towards them and help them discern what they want to redefine their self-image or behaviors that they've been doing. And I also want to touch on these quote-unquote addictive behaviors or patterns that, whether or not it's substance abuse or food focus or rituals around food, they're often reinforced by the surrounding behaviors, because we often make associations. The quote-unquote trigger, which is a popular term we hear nowadays, but there are cues that we get along the way that reinforce it. And once we actually engage in that behavior, it's not necessarily that behavior that we're chasing. It's more so the feeling leading up to it. So that's something that's important to explore as well.
Let me ask you both a relatively hard question, and I'll spoil the plot. The answer is, of course, it depends and it's individual, but I think these are hot topics that people ask related to physique sport or dieting. If someone has, or is recovering from an eating disorder or body image concern, is it always a negative thing that they're competing? Is it always them just finding an excuse to keep doing the behavior? Or are there times when someone could find a positive outlet and transition to physique sport from having an eating disorder history? And the reason I ask is because depending upon what data you look at, we take all the athletes out there in the world. There's like this hierarchy of the likelihood that you had a previous eating disorder. And it's like physique sport's at the top for body image concerns or prior eating disorder. Lower than that is other athletic sports or weight class restricted sports. So an example might be if you're a diver or a gymnast or a competitive powerlifter in a weight class restricted sport, etc. Anything where you are modifying your nutrition and trying to look or be a certain weight. But man, top of the pile, that's us, physique sports. So what do you guys think about that?
In terms of whether or not it's a good thing or knowing...
Yeah, basically
whether or not
my
someone
question
that has
is,
a history.
If someone has a history of eating disorders or, is in recovery from one, could it, if you could snap your fingers and change underlying behaviors, perspectives, cognitions, views of self, would them just simply not participating in physique sport be a net positive? Or is there some facilitative way that it could actually be a good thing to be in physique sport? Because I've heard different people talk about this differently, and I've heard clinicians get very angry with the idea that someone would suggest that, a positive step away from the eating disorder is competing in physique sport. And they've been like, no, that's a Band-Aid at best. Yeah. And it's just giving them an excuse to participate in this harmful behavior or this harmful experience for them that is now, covered in this veneer of bodybuilding. And by the way, the whole bodybuilding community and industry is basically just people with eating disorders or disordered eating who are making excuses for each other.
Eric, I'll have to say it depends.
I knew it.
I'll share my personal journey. I've shared with you guys that I have had a history of an eating disorder. Where it was diagnosable, and I had treatment for it. For me, part of my recovery, if you will, and this was well after a couple of years, and I was weight restored, I was engaging in healthy behaviors, bodybuilding, or just working in the gym, lifting weights, doing powerlifting as well. That was helpful for me. It was almost like a bumpers in bowling. That was bumpers for me, where fully engaging in intuitive eating or not exercising and only just like walking or doing yoga was not enriching for me. If anything, like learning more about nutrition, seeing those numbers, seeing my body change in a way that I actually want it to versus idealizing something and not engaging in those positive behaviors, that was detrimental for me versus tracking, versus seeing my weight change, versus doing mesocycles and just exposing myself in this community and diving deep into it. So for me, it was good. And I actually had my therapist and my prior therapist in treatment tell me, don't do it. They got angry. These were old therapists, but they told me to steer away from it, and I didn't listen. or I almost felt guilty that I was doing something wrong. But at the same time, I felt so good about myself when I would lift and feeding myself more. So that's anecdotal, and it's my own personal experience. And I wouldn't necessarily recommend it directly to a client that I'm working with. I would more so just explore with them what is happening in their process. How are they responding to it? I wouldn't want them to necessarily dive in and compete within the first year, but let's see how you're doing when you're just consistently taking care of yourself, lifting, sleeping well, eating well, and take it from there.
Mm-hmm.
So that's my take on it.
Berto, what's your experience been in the trenches? Because I know that personally, I know a ton of people, either as friends, colleagues, or actual clients who've probably been on both sides of the spectrum. This, like, what is your perspective on this?
Yeah, man, I think for some people it could be not the best idea, but then you have other folks kind of like Amanda, where it's like, hey, like I am like right here just doing this thing, middle fingers out, like that sort of deal, where it's like, it seems like I'm playing with fire, but there's more to it than just that. Because there's a large component of this sport that when it's done right, like there's a lot of self-care involved. Like I said this on a podcast a while back that, like, if like my college kid got into bodybuilding, I'm like, I guess we probably have to have the drug talk, but there's worse things they could be getting into, because what's he going to be doing on like Friday nights? He's going to be going to bed early. If he wants to find time for bodybuilding, he's going to have to prioritize, structure his time well, learn to be organized. There's so many good things that you pull from this, and the contest prep is kind of like the most advanced version of that if you do it right. So for most people who come from that background, like it's going to be like quite the road to get there. But I don't think they should not have access to it, or just like bodybuilding in general. Because there's so many things like it makes you so much more stress aware than like other folks. Like for example, it's like, oh, if I had a bad workout, I retrace my steps. Oh, it was like this and that happened. And then eventually you start connecting it to other things in life. Oh, that's why I keep reacting that way when I talk to, said family member. It makes you more self-aware in so many ways, not just the negative things that you hear about.
Mm-hmm.
So it's more than just a sport. It's a fantastic skill to have, like just being able to, strength train properly, to eat in a way that makes sense in today's like modern world. It's like right up there with like I don't know a whole lot about finances, but like my baby girl's gonna learn about, like, this is one thing I'm very competent in, and I'm like, this is a worthwhile investment that's gonna pay dividend for a long, long time. So I think a lot of people just see like the surface, the veins, the separation, the muscle, the weights being lifted, but it's so much more. If to get those things, a lot of things have to happen on the back end, and a lot of other forms of growth have to take place, especially if you want to do this for an extended period of time, and that's the only way you're going to get those results. So yeah, I would recommend this, what we do, some form of it, to just about anyone. It's just going to look vastly different, and with that subset of people, you just really have to be aware about like where you kick things off from, and how hard and how far to push, because man, a lot of folks who deal with these things, that's the issue, man, is like they have certain characteristics that's like, oh, you're a dog, you can push, you can like starve yourself really well, right? Like you never cheat on your diet, and that can actually work against them. So yeah, it's a many different answers for many different people, but everyone should be exercising and eating well, and strength training should be a part of that exercising.
Yeah, no, I love that. You guys really kind of focused on what it can be and the individual experience, right? And I would say it does bother me that there are some clinicians out there who would take such a black and white view of this, and why it is, so important when you're trying to find someone, if you're a practitioner, if you're a coach, and you want to find a practitioner to refer to who actually understands the potential pros and cons that come from participating in this thing we call bodybuilding, competitive or otherwise, because you don't want someone who only has a surface level understanding and only sees the negative sides of it from their clinical experience and hasn't seen potential positives, because you're dealing with survivorship bias on the other side. You're not seeing the survivors. You're actually seeing the people who decided to come into your office. And like, if you're just a clinician who doesn't lift, and you have all these people with eating disorders who also bodybuild, that can really provide you it's not a representative sample. That's all the people who have struggled with things. And that's, there's a legitimate issue there, like things that sometimes get labeled as quote unquote diet culture, or people who are motivated to participate in bodybuilding because of a poor image of self, or a poor self-image, or low self-worth, who are trying to look a certain way because they feel that's the only way they can be acceptable or worthy of love. That's very different than someone taking a perspective of empowerment and control and an artistic idea of, I want to make myself into my own sculpture. There's so many ways that it could be framed, going back to framing and the importance of it, that are not negative, that are incredibly powerful and transformative in a positive way, that I think all of us have experienced on this call. And for a clinician to be wholly unaware of that and paint with such broad strokes can do more harm than good, as we've talked about. And even if a step above the individual, just think about this from like an eating disorder classification perspective. It's a big difference between someone going through cyclical periods of dieting in the off season who has binge eating disorder versus anorexia nervosa. Like if you have been someone who has made yourself so small that you nearly died, and now you're actually going through purposeful phases of being in a surplus, increasing your body mass, trying to get stronger and bigger, that's a huge win, I would just think, as a non-specialist. But if you're someone who every time you restrict, it results in binge eating, and you're like, let me do a contest prep, I'd be like, let's pump the brakes and really think about this and make sure that we've dealt with that before we decide to create like a long-term version of bulimia that you're already diagnosed with, right? So, to me, it seems readily apparent that you can't deal with this in broad brushstrokes, and that's kind of a red flag for anyone who is needing help or looking for help, that you don't want to see people speaking in really broad brushstrokes about this, positive or negative, because they're probably kind of dealing with some their own biases or biased experiences. I don't know if you guys have anything else to add to that.
I agree fully with that. I don't have anything else to add.
Well, I think you guys have added a ton to this conversation. I do want to just both give you guys the opportunity. Anything you feel that we haven't covered, speak now or forever hold your peace.
I'm holding my peace. All
right. Berto's sitting there holding this peace too. That sounds weird. Hey, folks.
How'd you know?
I can just tell when you look at me in a certain way. But no, in all seriousness, folks, this has been a lovely conversation. It's been a much needed update. It has been years since we've talked about this. We've talked about a lot of individual factors, definitions, and really what it comes down to is that if you want to participate in this whole thing we call bodybuilding, competitive or otherwise, you want to do so eyes wide open, fully aware of everything that goes into it, and knowing that there's modifiable and non-modifiable factors for any pursuit, especially if we're talking fat loss. You're going to have to, even if you do everything evidence-based right and, in the least invasive way possible, if you want to modify your body composition, you want to lose weight, especially if you want to get shredded and get on stage, there's going to be some biologically driven changes to your behavior and perspective, and there's going to be some dissonance, especially if you're getting to a level of leanness that's simply not sustainable. And even if you are trying to move towards something that is sustainable, that's going to require a redefinition of what is sustainable for you, because you wouldn't be having to try to get there in the first place if it wasn't, right? Which means behavior change, which means lifestyle change, which does require, you dealing with some dissonance and eventually adopting a new perspective, framing, and habits. So do that in the most effective and least harmful way possible, but also be aware of your tendencies, your personality, your history, and the potential risks of some of these moderating, not causative factors, which could bring back up some of those issues. And just make sure that you have people you can reach out to, people who have the scope of practice and the skills to help you, and also the niche community-specific awareness that they can't just take away a coping strategy from you if that's what it becomes and expect you to be fine. Or simply, ignore all the potential positives of what you're doing and only focus on the potential negatives. Folks, it's been a pleasure. Thank you for joining us, and we'll catch you next time on the next episode of the 3DMJ podcast.